Welcome back to the first and largest online Python conference in Sri Lanka, organized by ISEC in University of Moratuwa in collaboration with Matific Sri Lanka. PyCon Sri Lanka 2022. Moving on to our evening sessions in line, let me introduce our first speaker for the session. Introduction to Django REST Framework. So it's conducted by none other than Mr. Chamindu Munasinghe. So before we move on to the keynote speaker, let me introduce him. Chamindu has 20 years of experience in the software industry as an engineer and a software architect, designing numerous enterprise, mobile, machine learning, and IoT applications. He is currently the CTO of Zend Technologies. So before we move on, let me also mention that after this keynote session, you can direct your questions and questions directly to Mr. Chamindu through the chat box so that I can ask him all the questions that you have directed through the chat box. So without further ado, let me invite Mr. Chamindu Munasinghe to the spotlight. Hi, Mr. Chamindu, and the platform is all yours. Hi, Mr. Chamindu, you are muted. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah,
No
I do this all the time. So thank you very much, Prasansa, for the introduction, and then thank you everybody for having me here today. So since we've started a bit late, let's get down to it right away. So I've created a couple of polls just to get an idea about the audience, whether like you have used Django framework before and whether you have used Django REST framework. And anyways, this is going to be an introductory session, so we are not going to get too much into detail today. The beautiful thing about Django and any other almost all the Python frameworks is although they are very powerful, they are very easy to get started. So I hope everybody can see my screen. I have a small slide deck and demo that goes with it. Right. So let's get started. I'll start sharing. Okay. So I hope everybody can see my screen. So today's session is going to be about the Django REST framework, right? So to give you a brief overview about today's session, first we'll talk a bit about the Django framework, right? A quick introduction, right? And then we'll talk a bit about the Django REST framework, which is an add-on that you can use with Django to implement a RESTful API. Right? And then we'll briefly talk about what are the major components that comprise this REST framework and how they work together, and we'll basically do a small demo to it, right? So let's get started. So so what is Django? Django is a web framework. Like there are like a ton of web frameworks for different languages. I mean, even for Python, there are like a lot of other frameworks, right? Uh, so why is Django so special? I mean, I came across a Django framework about 10 years ago, when we had to do this website that has to be done quickly, and also like in my previous place, we had this, engineering culture where you have to do unit test and all that. So while doing rapid application development, we have to do all that. And then, I came across this framework, which is Django, right? Even the framework's tagline, it says a web framework for perfectionists with deadlines, right? So it's a rapid application development framework, but it doesn't compromise on the quality of the application and the architecture. So that why do you call it a rapid application development framework? because one of the coolest features is that it has a built-in admin side. Like once you define your entities and you get your database up and running, there's a beautiful admin interface that you can use to handle the basic, the CRUD actions. And it has very easy forms library where you can, once you have an entity, you can just create a form for it, to capture the data, uh, and do the validations and all that. It's almost like zero code, but uh, if you need to do any customizations, you can do it, right? And then it has a very powerful ORM, right? The Django ORM is very powerful. It has a lot of features. It implements the active record pattern, right? I think a lot of web frameworks that are, developed in these dynamic languages use the active record pattern. Like even if you take the Rails ORM, it implements active record. So Python, the Django ORM is similar, right? And the best thing I love about the Django framework is it is modular. So what do you mean by modular? So it lets you define reusable components, right? Let's say, for example, a classic example might be, say, I'm developing a blog, right, using Django, right? And then I need to add comments, a feature for my users to be able to add comments to this blog, right? It's highly likely that I'll find a third party uh, Django package that implements this comments feature. And then I can, connect my blog and my data entities in my application with that and use it to provide the commenting facility for uh, my blog, right? Like that, there is uh, like there are a lot of packages out there. Like since Python is a dynamic language, like since even the code can be patched dynamically, what you call the monkey patching. Uh, there are a lot of powerful packages out there that will change the entire behavior of your application just by installing and configuring those Python packages. For example, if you, let's say, if you want to provide version control for your entities, right? There's a package called Django reversion. You just edit and configure, and then all your entities will be versioned, right? Even your custom entities that you define in your applications, right? So it's very powerful, right? And it's very secure as well. There's a lot of security features inbuilt that you don't have to worry about. Let's say, for example, now I remember, like, about 10 years ago when I first used Django, it had this CSRF protection built in. Even frameworks like Spring or .NET, I don't know whether it's available out of the box, right? So those like security features are available out of the box, right? And then uh, okay, yeah. So that's about Django, right? So the Django architecture. I'll quickly go through the Django architecture. So Django is a framework. It's similar to model view controller, but it's slightly different. In Django, we have models that talk to database using the ORM, and then we have views, right? Views are responsible for, actual views are Python functions, or you can have Python classes as well that handle the request and provide the response, right? And templates are, traditionally what you call views in, if you take ASP.NET MVC, what you have that in that race, the view engine racer views or something like that. Those are called templates in Django, right? And then you have middleware which can interpret, which sits in between, in the middle of the request processing pipeline, which can do things like security, session management, and like CSRF token validation, things like that. So this is the kind of like a high level architecture for Django, right? Of course, there are like things like context processors that I have not mentioned here in the interest of time, and like we don't, since this is an introductory session, that we are not going to a lot of detail, right? So basically, let's create a small Django application. But before we discuss about the REST framework, let's create a simple Django application and see it run. Okay. So uh, let me switch to my terminal, right? I hope you guys can see my terminal, right? I'm going to start my project. So I have a folder called PyCon here. Here I want to start my Django application, right? So uh, first of all, I'm going to create a virtual environment. Let's call VRF demo. So I created a virtual environment and now it is active, right? First, I want to install my the packages that are required for this demo. So I'm going to use pip. So right. Now I have installed Django, right? Now I want to start a project. Django admin is the tool that you use to bootstrap a project, right? Say, Lanka. Now it creates a folder called PyCon Lanka. I can go to this folder, and uh, here I have this folder structure which I will open in Visual Studio Code. So let me minimize this. Right here, I have some files right in my project, which is the one important thing is this settings.py. This Python file configures your Django application, right? So, for example, now I earlier I told you that Python, Django has this concept of reusable apps, right? So here are the currently installed apps, right? So the country admin, country both, country content types. These are the applications that you get by default, and your applications also go in this, right? And other stuff here. One important thing here is you configure the database here, right? So by default, it uses SQLite, right? So I mean, I wouldn't recommend you to go with SQLite for a production deployment, but here I'm going to use it since we are going to do a simple demo. And okay, so you can refer to the Django documentation to get a detail of this. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all the password validators since I'm going to use a simple password. Here, I'll remove all those password validators, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to go back to my terminal, right? Now, I have this manage.py file, right? Now, this is going to be your interface to your Django projects, right? You can, do various things, like run the development server, do the database migrations, all that. You use the manage file CLI tool, right? So basically, what I can do is I'll run this start app. Now I'm going to start an application. These are the reusable apps. Typically, your application, if it's simple one, you can have one app, or you can have multiple apps if it's a complex application. So I'm going to start app called API, right? Okay. So then it creates a separate folder called APIs, right? So uh, it has several files by default, right? So basically, I'm going to I'm going to use the models.py, right? Here, what I'll do is I'll create a simple database model, right? Let's assume that you are doing an application. It lets you manage details about, a set of people, right? So let me define a entity called person. Basically, you have to inherit from the model base class to define your entity, right? And then you define your fields as class level fields, right? So character fields, you require max length, right? Let's say it's 100, and it has to be there, right? It's required. So I'll say it's required, and then last name. And false. Let's set one field called birthday. So this is my model, right? So what is that? Okay. So let me define this method. I mean, I'm going to override the str method, right? And then I'm going to say just display the name and last name, right? So first name space self last name. Okay, so I'm done, right? I define my entity, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an interface so that I can edit this, right? So it's pretty easy. What you do is here, I import my model. Models import person and admin side register person. Right? And I'm going to go back to my terminal. I'm going to do, sorry, before that, I have to make sure this new application that I created is installed here. So for this API, right? And also since I'm going to use REST framework here, I'm going to add it here as well. But for right now, this is not going to do anything because since we didn't create any REST framework views yet, but we just add it. So what I'm going to do is now, okay, so basically now what happens is here it migrated the database, right? So it created all the entities from uh, the applications that were installed, right? But I forgot to do one thing here. Since I have to create the migrations for my application. I define my model, and then I have to create the database migrations for it. What will happen is it will compare your models and any existing migrations that you have in your app and make new migrations to make so that the database state will be matching to your model. So all right, so here it created this migration called 001 initial.py, and it gives a brief description of what it's going to do. It's going to create the person model that we defined earlier, right? Okay, so let's run migrate again. Okay, so now what I can do is now to access the admin application, I need a user to log in, right? I'm going to create a super user, right? So again, sorry. Yeah. So let's leave it at Chamindu. Let's see. Simple password. Okay. And now I can run this application using Python manage pipe run server. Right. Okay. Let's see. Uh, if you have this running. So this is the default home page, and let's see how the built-in admin works, right? So you go to admin. All right, so this gives you a nice admin UI where I can manipulate the entities that I created, right? So built in the Django contrib auth package gives you these groups and users, right? And then my API application, it has created this persons entity. So I'll go and add a couple of persons here, right? So yeah, Chamindu, Munasinghe. So birthday, yeah, we'll simply pick a date, right? Save and add another. So, okay, right. Okay, so now if I go back, see, I can see that entity. So this why I overwritten this the toString method is the str method is what is displayed here is the output of the str method, right? Okay, so that's the first part of it, right? So I created the application quickly and with admin UI, right? And we created some entities, right? So let's go back to my slide deck. Right? Okay, so we were here, right? So now it is done. So we have a working application with a nice admin UI, and then I want to provide a API on top of this, right? So uh, let's talk a bit about the Django REST framework, right? So it provides a Django package. It's an add-on to Django that provides REST API capabilities for your existing applications, right? So it provides a browsable API, right? That means once you develop the API, you can easily test it using the browser itself, right? You don't have to use a tool like Postman. It provides a nice web UI for you to test this API, and it provides things like data validation, like authentication and authorization, and also like things like even rate limiting is there, but these days typically you would use something like an API gateway to do that sort of thing. But if you want to rate limit at the API implementation level, you can do that as well. So what are the main components of Django REST framework, right? How how they work together to provide this framework. First of all, you have serializers, right? So basically serializers are in charge of converting your models into Python native data types, and then from and also collecting data, and then validating and cleaning it, right? So if you are experienced with Django, this is very similar to what a Django form does, right? Mapping an entity into a native Python data types, and then uh, matching converting it back. But this doesn't actually serialize into the end format, whether like JSON, because that is done by the renderer. So because this has a browsable API, HTML based API as well, interface as well, the renderers take care of that, right? So by default you have this model serializer, right? So basically what it will do is you just have to provide the model, and it will create, it will basically automatically create the serializer for you. And then you have this hyperlinked model serializer as well. Basically, if you want to implement this HATEOS or like purely 100% REST based hyperlink based navigation, you can use a hyperlinked model serializer, which typically I don't use. I stick with the primary key based model serializer where the relationships will be rendered as IDs, right, in the JSON. And then you have API views, right? So basically API views is the counterpart of a view in Django, right? It provides things, it does things like authentication and authorization, and then the content negotiation, like when a request comes based on the accept header, it will either uh, do the negotiation and whether to send JSON or something else, right? And then there are some generic views that are based on uh, the API view, right? Which is the list create API view and retrieve update destroy API view. The list create API view typically maps to the resource root URL, something like, let's say in this case, it could map to, something like our API root / persons, where it will, for the get request, it will do the listing, and then if you do a post, it will create a new resource for you, right? And the retrieve update destroy API view is where it will map to something like, person / person ID, where it will let you work with a single resource or a single entity, right? um, Right. So, I mean, if you are getting started with the DRF, you don't have to use a view directly. You can use the view set, which is a handy abstraction that will provide you, for example, if you want to provide an interface or API endpoints to handle all the CRUD functionality, you can use a view set, right? The model view set will provide you the full access to the CRUD, all the CRUD operations like create, read, update, delete. And read-only model view set will provide only the interfaces for listing and viewing a single item. Uh, Another component that you typically use is a router, right? A router is basically the component that generates the URL patterns that Django used to route your request to the uh, API views, right? So there are two types of routers. A simple router will generate your URLs to your all the resources that are registered with the router. The default router will also create a API homepage. This is very useful for the browsable API. So authentication components, right? So there are different types of authentication in the Django REST framework, right? You can use basic authentication, which is the username and password, the basic header, but that is not really recommended unless you do only in development, right? And then you have session authentication that will authenticate the user using the Django's built-in session cookies, right? And then token authentication is a separate application that is available with DRF. If you when you install that and configure that, for each Django user, there will be a separate entity that you can use to create and manage tokens, right? These are like fixed tokens, like the tokens that you get from AWS. And then if you want to do like OAuth authentication, there are third-party libraries like Django OAuth Toolkit. And then if you want to do a simple JWT authentication, you can use Django REST Framework simple JWT. The advantage of a JWT is, it's not an opaque token like the token used by token authentication, because it has enriched information. You don't need to hit the database to validate the token every time. Right? And then there are permissions, right? Again, like these permissions are implemented as Python classes, right? There are various permissions. I have listed a few here, right? And you can always implement custom permissions. Basically, what you do is each view will have a list of permissions, and then when a request comes, all these permission classes will be invoked, right? And then if any of them returns false, an exception will be thrown and the operation will be denied, right? So basically, there are two methods that you can override if you are doing uh, custom permissions: the has permission method and the has object permission method, which will let you implement object level permissions. Okay, so I mean, enough talking. So let's quickly create an API for our application, right? In the meantime, I'll just see if there are any questions and anything that I can answer before moving on. All right, so I'm just going through the questions. Okay, I think most of these questions are high level stuff. So I think I'll take these questions after I do the demo, right? So let's quickly, in the interest of time also, let's quickly go through the demo. So I'm going to stop my development site here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first create a serializer, right? So in my API application, I'm going to add a new Python file. I'm going to call it Serializers. So yeah. So instead of typing from hand, since we are quickly running out of time, I have a couple of snippets that I saved previously. So let me open those. Right. Okay. So here, this is my serializer, the person serializer, right? Which I'm deriving from the model serializer, right? And then there's an inner class that I define called meta. And this is typically how you add metadata into Django models, and the REST framework uses the same thing, right? As part of this meta information, I'm saying this serializer is this person model should be associated with this serializer, right? And for the fields, I'm saying I'm using this string literal called underscore all, right? This is actually a shortcut. If you don't want to specify uh, individual fields, and if you want to use serialize and deserialize all the fields, right? You can use this, right? Let me save this, right? My Visual Studio Code is not recognizing, so I think I have to switch the interpreter to my virtual environment, right? I think I'm on this, right? So let's see. That's now. Okay, doesn't matter, right? So this is my serializer, and now I need a view set, right? So let me create a view set that will. Sorry. I already have my views.py. So this is where typically you implement your views, right? So, I mean, if you use Django, this is where you define your views, right? Whether it is a class-based view or a function-based view, right? What I can do here is now, again, I'm going to copy paste from my this thing, and but I'll explain the code, right? So, okay, so here, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a view set that is based off of model view set, right? This view set is will generate the API views that can be used to implement the card actions for a given model, right? So here I have to specify a query set, right? In a Django query set is it represents the underlying the entity, right, where you can query, right? For example, this query set person objects.all represents all the persons in the database, right? So you can, I mean, these are lazy, these query sets are lazy. I mean, just because I execute this doesn't mean that the underlying query is going to get executed. Only when this result is iterated will the database query actually be made, right? And then I have to specify a serializer here, right? Uh, and here I'm going to use the person serializer, right? And here is where I define my permissions, right? I mean, of course, you can at a global level on the settings.py, you can include these permission classes at the global level, but also you can define all the permission classes as a attribute of your view set as well. What will happen is this is a list if I have multiple permission classes, all these uh, permission classes will be called, and they have to return true to make sure that the user has permission, right? So it is inside the permission you can access the current request object. Using that, you can get the request user and how his data, the user data you can get from that request parameter. Okay, so I have my view set. Now I need to configure the routers, right? So basically, let me go to the, let me create a file here called urls.py, right? It's always good practice for each individual API application to define your own URLs, and then basically you can include it from the main project's URL. So it is modular, right? So let me again copy the URL configuration from this, right? Okay, so here what I'm doing is I'm importing the routers module from DRF, and then I'm importing my person view set, right? And this Django URLs module has some helper functions that we are going to use, right? So in the URL configuration, you are supposed to define a variable called URL patterns, right? Which defines a list of URL mapping rules. So basically, here what I'm saying is, at the top level, if at the top level, without anything, to include the router URLs, right? So router URLs again gives you back a list of URLs. What I'm going to say is delegate it down to the router URLs if the path is this, and if the path is auth, I'm I'm saying delegate it down to the URL configuration of the REST framework. So REST framework provides a couple of default UIs for you to log in. This is very handy, and it works well with the browsable API, right? So so that is that. And here on the main URL configuration, I would have to say API. Let's scroll down, delegate down to our application, these routes. Right, so I have to include API.url. So it will load this API URLs, right? Okay, so let's see if this thing works now. Hopefully, yes. Okay, so now I'm already logged into this, so this should work, right? So okay, so now here's my API. Now this is the browsable API, right? This is the interface that is displayed to the web browsers, right? Now, so this will give you a list of the available API endpoints, and now I can click here and go to my persons API, right? So by default, the API/persons gives me a list of the persons. Now here's where the hyperlinked model serializer versus the model serializer differs. If it was a hyperlinked model serializer, you will get a reference to this entity, right? If you are implementing full Helios style of APIs, you can use the hyperlink model serializer. Okay. So yeah, now let's try this with a different client. Let's try this with Postman. Right? Let me open up Postman. I already have configured this. Sorry. Okay, so I have already configured basic authentication, but let's try without this authorization header, right? And if I send, see, it says invalid username and password, right? Here I need to provide my basic authentication. Now the response is not an HTML. I get the actual JSON representation of my API, right? Uh, all right. So yeah, so that concludes the demo, right? And let's go back to the slide deck, right? So here I have listed some helpful URLs for you guys to do this Django project host. Where this is where you can get the download the Django framework. And unlike other frameworks, Django documentation is very comprehensive. I mean, you can get up and running in a couple of hours, even if you are a total beginner to Django, right? And then Django REST framework is there. Their documentation is pretty good as well. And there's this other library that you would typically won't use. I don't have time to demo this. This is DRFYASG, right? It stands for Django REST Framework, yet another Swagger generator, right? So, I mean, these days people are using Open API, right? So, if you want to display a Swagger UI, or if you want to, dynamically generate Open API definitions or Open API schemas from your API, you can use this. It's very easy. And this is the virtual ANV wrapper that I'm using. It's if you are working with multiple Python versions, and instead of polluting your global site packages, you can easily use this virtual ANV wrapper. It creates some shortcuts commands for your bash shell, makes it very easy to work with virtual environments, right? Okay, so that is the demo, right? Thank you very much, right? And maybe I'll take some time to if you guys have time, I'll take some time to answer the questions, right? I hope you guys learned something. I know it was very quick, not enough time to go through in detail, uh, but I hope you guys uh, found it helpful. So Prasancha, how does it work? Like, can I take some questions and then from the list and then go through this? Okay.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
We just have only 5 minutes. You can take a couple of questions that you are comfortable with answering.
Okay. So yeah. So okay. So yeah. So we'll go through this quickly, right? So basically, one is asking why Django REST framework over Flask, right? Okay. So that is a very good question, right? What I would when I would use Django REST framework is basically if you have a Django application that you have already developed, right? And then you want to provide an API to augment that, I would use Django, right? And if you want to rapidly develop an API, I would use Django, right? For example, now about a month back, I had for a POC for IoT based application, I needed to quickly develop a REST interface to a timescale DB database that we were using, right? I Fortunately there was a Django backend for timescale DB, right? And then I just whipped up a Django project, in half an hour, build an API, right? If you want to do a dedicated API for a microservice, I would go with something like Flasko, Fast API or something like that. Okay. Uh, Now, again, so at one instance, would we not use Django, right? So Tarindu is asking, when would you not use Django? That is also a very good question, right? So I'll answer the other question. When would you use Django, right? Then you can, uh, imply when not to use it, right? These days, a lot of people won't use uh, single page applications. Nothing wrong with it, but sometimes, in a web application, this responsiveness and this quick interactivity that SPAs provide are not the primary goal. Let's say, for example, you are developing an application which has to be SEO friendly, right? And then social sharing friendly, right? You want to share this on social platforms with the pages, and then it's highly recommended you to use a server-side rendered framework, right? Not a client-side application. So actually, the Django framework itself was developed by a online news publishing company, right? So that's a very good use case for Django, right? I mean, if you are doing some sort of a single page application that talks to microservices, maybe with micro front ends, I wouldn't use Django. And I wouldn't use Django for a application that has a very complex domain model, right? Because Django, the ORM is tightly, the ORM implements active record pattern, and the persistence is tightly coupled to the domain model, right? For example, if you want to adopt a development practice like domain driven design, frameworks like Django make it somewhat difficult to do DDD. So I wouldn't go for Django if that is the case. But other than that, for your typical server-side rendered or typical web application, Django, I would highly recommend to use Django. I hope uh, that question is answered, right? Okay, so this is again something that I would like to answer. Is this GraphQL question, right? Is GraphQL's popularity threatening REST train? Okay, so that's a very, very good point. And, I like to discuss, although not directly related to Django, GraphQL is good, right? But the problem with GraphQL is, because I work with bigger companies with a lot of products, and API governance is key in when you have a lot of API consumers, right? GraphQL is one problem with GraphQL is it lets you do anything. REST will expose very well defined interface to the clients, right? But GraphQL interface is arbitrary, right? Then it makes it very difficult for you to change these contracts. We don't know what the client is doing, right? Dependency tracking and all that is going to be very difficult with GraphQL, right? The other thing is when you use GraphQL, now this is not inherently a problem with GraphQL, but the way you architecture these applications is you tend to uh, expose GraphQL over your CRUD repositories, right? Then where's your domain model going to be? Domain logic will be, right? If you implement GraphQL on top of a rich domain model, that is fine, but it's difficult, right? So, but I mean, if you implement GraphQL over a thin layer of CRUD repositories, I mean, it's why don't you just implement one endpoint that will let anybody run a SQL query and then return the result? Similar, right? So of course, I mean, there are security implications there, but essentially that's what we are doing if you implement the entire database out as a GraphQL, right? Uh, are we out of time, Prasancha?
Yes, you can take one more question and we can wrap it up.
Okay, so okay. All right. Okay, so yeah, I'll take one question. What are the WSGI servers that we can use with Django? I mean, yeah, you can use any WSGI, right? Unicorn, uh, you can easily use, right? So I mean, it works with any WSGI servers, and recently Django supports asynchronous ASGI, right? The latest version of the interface for web applications, asynchronous server gateway interface, like things like Daphne or Unicorn, right? So those things also Django supports, but I don't think as of now the Django ORM is async, right? So I mean, if you use Django with async server, as of now you won't be able to fully utilize the async nature of that, right? Yeah. So I guess out of time.
Yes, Mr. Chamindu, since we are running out of time, I think we are good to end the session.
Yeah.
And first of all, I should pay my Highest gratitude to you for being our guest speaker for today, for making this session a success along with your knowledgeable inputs. And also, I thank each and every participant for actively participating and giving out questions for Mr. Chamindu to answer that showed your interactiveness. And also, I hope that you got great insights with along for the introduction of Django REST Framework. So thank you so much, Mr. Chamindu. And within a couple of minutes, we will move on to the next session. So hope all our participants will join us with the next session. Thank you. And
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, Prasansa. And I will drop my email address in the chat so that you have any questions, you can always connect to me offline. You can message me in LinkedIn or whatever. I'll be
yes,
here to help. I'll be happy to help. Okay.
thank you. Thank you
Thank you.
very
Okay,
much. Have
thanks.
a nice day.
Okay. You too. Bye bye.